On a cold November night in 1987, a seasoned cowboy named Jack Thornton witnessed something that would change his life forever. Standing alone on his remote Arizona ranch, miles from civilization, he saw lights dancing across the skylights that moved with impossible precision, defying every law of physics he knew. They weren't planes. They weren't stars. They were something else entirely. When Jack woke the next morning and rode out across his property, what he discovered in the sand sent chills down his spine. Strange tracks stretching for miles across the desert floor, patterns that no earthly creature could have made. This is the true story of a man who came face to face with the unknown, a mystery that would consume him and divide his community. What really happened that night over the Thornton Ranch? And what left those inexplicable marks in the Arizona desert? Join us as we unravel one of the most compelling UFO encounters ever documented. A story of lights, tracks, and a truth that remains hidden in the shadows of the American Southwest. Jack Thornton had spent 43 years working the land, and he thought he'd seen everything the desert had to offer. His ranch sprawled across 800 acres of Arizona wilderness, nestled between towering red rock formations and endless stretches of sand and sagebrush. It was isolated country, the kind of place where your nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and the silence at night was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. Jack liked it that way. He'd inherited the property from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him, and the Thornton family had been raising cattle on this unforgiving land for 3 generations. Jack was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or superstition. He believed in what he could see, touch, and rope. That November evening started like any other. Jack had spent the day repairing fence lines on the eastern section of his property, hard work that left his hands raw and his back aching. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he loaded his tools into his pickup truck and headed back toward the ranch house. The temperature was dropping fast, as it always did in the desert once the sun disappeared. By the time Jack finished his dinner of beans and cornbread, darkness had settled over the land like a heavy blanket, and the stars were beginning to emerge in their thousands. Jack stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, to smoke his evening cigarette and check on the cattle. It was a ritual he'd performed countless times, a quiet moment of reflection before bed. The cattle were settled in the north pasture, barely visible as dark shapes against the darker landscape. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. But then, at exactly 9:47 by his watch, Jack noticed something strange on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be a plane, perhaps a military aircraft from the base 70 miles north. But as he watched, the light began to behave in ways that made his coffee mug pause halfway to his lips. The light wasn't moving in a straight line. It was dancing, weaving through the sky with fluid grace, making sharp 90-degree turns that would have torn apart any conventional aircraft. Then it was joined by another light and another, until 5 distinct points of brilliance were performing an impossible aerial ballet above his ranch. Jack set down his coffee with trembling hands and gripped the porch railing. The lights were silent, not a whisper of engine noise carrying across the desert air. They pulsed with colors he'd never seen before, shifting from white to blue to something that seemed almost purple, a shade that hurt to look at directly. For 20 minutes, Jack stood frozen on his porch, watching the lights execute maneuvers that defied everything he understood about flight and physics. They would hover motionless for long moments, then suddenly accelerate to impossible speeds, shooting across miles of sky in seconds before stopping instantly with no deceleration. At one point, all 5 lights arranged themselves in a perfect pentagon formation, rotating slowly like a cosmic wheel. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to look away, to go inside and pretend he hadn't seen anything, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the spectacle unfolding above his land. Then, without warning, the lights descended. They dropped from their high altitude toward his ranch, moving with purposeful intent, and Jack felt a surge of primal fear, unlike anything he'd experienced in his decades of living in this harsh country. He'd faced rattlesnakes, scorpions, flash floods, and even a mountain lion once, but this was different. This was fear of the unknown, fear of something beyond his comprehension. The lights came lower, until they were hovering just above his southern pasture, perhaps 300 feet off the ground. The glow they cast illuminated the landscape in an eerie, otherworldly luminescence that made familiar terrain look alien and strange. Jack's cattle began to panic. Even from a distance, he could hear them lowing in distress, their cries carrying across the night air. They were running, stampeding in terror, crashing against fences in their desperation to escape whatever presence had invaded their territory. Jack knew he should do something, ride out and try to calm them, but his legs wouldn't move. He stood transfixed, watching as the lights began to move slowly across his southern pasture, traveling in a deliberate pattern that seemed almost like they were searching for something, or perhaps marking something. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 more minutes, the lights suddenly shot straight up into the sky with breathtaking speed, climbing higher and higher until they were just pinpoints again, and then they were gone, vanished as if they'd never existed at all. The desert returned to its natural darkness. The stars reclaimed their dominion over the night sky. The only sound was the distant agitation of Jack's cattle and the pounding of his own pulse in his ears. Jack remained on his porch for another hour, staring at the empty sky, waiting for the lights to return, but they didn't. Eventually, he went inside, but he didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and questioning his own sanity until the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the eastern horizon. As soon as there was enough light to see by, Jack saddled his horse, a reliable quarter horse named Rusty, who'd been his companion for 8 years. He needed to check on the cattle, assess any damage from their panic, and try to make sense of what he'd witnessed. His hands were still shaking slightly as he tightened the cinch, and he noticed that Rusty seemed nervous too, ears flicking constantly, nostrils flared as if sensing something wrong in the air. Jack patted the horse's neck reassuringly, though he felt anything but reassured himself. They rode out toward the southern pasture as the sun climbed higher, burning off the night's chill and casting long shadows across the desert floor. Jack's mind was racing, trying to construct rational explanations for what he'd seen. Maybe it had been some kind of military exercise, experimental aircraft being tested without public knowledge. Maybe it had been helicopters with unusual lighting systems. Maybe he'd been more tired than he realized, his mind playing tricks after a long day of hard labor. But even as he cycled through these possibilities, he knew they didn't fit. What he'd seen had been too strange, too impossible to explain away with conventional reasoning. When Jack reached the southern pasture, he found his cattle grouped together at the far end, still skittish and agitated. Several had minor injuries from running into fences, nothing serious, but enough to require attention. He'd deal with that later. First, he needed to inspect the area where the lights had been hovering, the section of pasture that had been bathed in that strange pulsing glow. He guided Rusty carefully across the terrain, his experienced eyes scanning the ground for anything unusual. What he found made him pull hard on the reins, bringing Rusty to an abrupt stop. There, pressed into the hard-packed desert soil, were tracks unlike anything Jack had ever encountered in his 43 years of ranching. They weren't animal tracks, not from cattle or horses or any wildlife native to Arizona. They weren't vehicle tracks either, no tire treads or familiar patterns. These were something entirely different, and as Jack dismounted to examine them more closely, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The tracks formed intricate patterns across roughly 2 acres of his pasture. They were geometric, precise, consisting of circular impressions about 8 inches in diameter, arranged in repeating sequences that created larger designs. Some circles were deeper than others, as if whatever had made them had applied varying amounts of pressure. The patterns seemed almost mathematical in their precision, with measurements that repeated consistently throughout the affected area. Between the circular impressions were strange drag marks, long grooves in the sand that connected the circles in ways that suggested purposeful movement, not random wandering. Jack knelt beside one of the clearest tracks, running his fingers along its edge. The impression was clean, sharply defined, with none of the crumbling or degradation you'd expect from something natural. The sand inside the circular depression was compressed, packed down with a force that must have been considerable given how hard the desert floor was in this area. He pulled out his pocket knife and tried to dig into one of the impressions, but the soil was compacted so tightly that his blade barely scratched the surface. Whatever had made these marks had been heavy, very heavy. As Jack stood and surveyed the full extent of the tracks, a pattern began to emerge. The impressions weren't random. They followed a specific path, creating what looked almost like a grid system across his pasture. There were 3 distinct trail systems, each one following a slightly different pattern, but all maintaining that same geometric precision. The trails intersected at several points, creating complex junction patterns where multiple sets of circular impressions overlapped. At the center of the affected area was a larger circle, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, where the ground showed signs of intense compression, as if something massive had rested there for an extended period. Jack pulled out his camera, an old Polaroid he kept in his saddlebag for documenting cattle injuries and fence damage, and began taking pictures. His hands were steadier now, replaced by a growing sense of determination. Whatever had happened here, he had evidence, physical proof that something extraordinary had occurred on his property. These weren't hallucinations or tricks of light. These were real, tangible marks in the earth, and they told a story that Jack was only beginning to understand. As he photographed the scene, Jack noticed other strange details. The vegetation within the tracked area appeared affected. Desert plants that should have been their normal gray-green color had taken on a yellowed, almost bleached appearance. When he touched them, the leaves crumbled easily between his fingers, brittle and desiccated, as if they'd been exposed to intense heat or radiation. Yet there were no signs of fire, no scorch marks or ash. Whatever had affected these plants had done so in a way that left no obvious traces beyond the dramatic change in their condition. The more Jack explored, the more unsettled he became. He found areas where rocks had been moved, not scattered randomly, but arranged in small piles at regular intervals along the track patterns. Some of these rocks showed unusual discoloration, with one side significantly lighter than the other, as if they'd been partially bleached by exposure to something. He collected several of these rocks, placing them carefully in his saddlebag alongside the developing Polaroids. By mid-morning, Jack had documented everything he could find. He remounted Rusty and rode slowly back toward the ranch house, his mind churning with questions. Should he report this to someone? Who would believe him? The local sheriff was a practical man who'd probably think Jack had lost his mind. The nearest Air Force base might be interested, or they might tell him he'd imagined the whole thing. Jack had always been a private person, someone who kept to himself and handled his own problems. But this felt bigger than something he could deal with alone. Jack made his decision as he unsaddled Rusty. He would drive into town and show his photographs to someone, anyone who might take him seriously. The town of Red Mesa was 30 miles away, a small community of about 2,000 people where everyone knew everyone else's business. Jack wasn't looking forward to the attention this would bring, but he couldn't keep this to himself. Something significant had happened, something that might pose a danger to others in the area, and he had a responsibility to report it. He showered, changed into clean clothes, and made the drive into town with his envelope of Polaroids on the passenger seat. The desert landscape rolled by, familiar and unchanged, But Jack saw it differently now. The sky that had always been just sky was now a place of mystery and potential threat. Every shadow cast by the rock formations seemed more ominous. The isolation he'd always cherished now felt more like vulnerability. In Red Mesa, Jack headed straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Bradley had held the position for 15 years, a competent lawman who handled the occasional bar fight or cattle rustling with equal efficiency. Jack found him at his desk, working through paperwork with the resigned expression of a man who'd rather be doing almost anything else. When Jack walked in, Bradley looked up with mild surprise. Jack Thornton rarely came to town, and he certainly never came to the sheriff's office. Jack laid out his story carefully, trying to present the facts without sounding crazy. He described the lights, their movements, their impossible maneuvers. He showed the Polaroids of the strange tracks, pointing out the geometric patterns and the compressed soil. He explained about the bleached plants and the rearranged rocks. Throughout his explanation, Sheriff Bradley's expression shifted from interest to skepticism to something that looked almost like pity. When Jack finished, Bradley leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. He'd seen the Polaroids, examined them carefully, but Jack could tell the man had already made up his mind. Bradley explained, in a tone that was probably meant to be gentle, but came across as patronizing, that Jack had probably seen weather balloons, or perhaps flares from a military exercise. The tracks could be explained by any number of natural phenomena, erosion patterns, mineral deposits, maybe even an elaborate prank by local teenagers. Bradley suggested that Jack had been working too hard, spending too much time alone out on that ranch, and maybe what he needed was a vacation, some time to rest and get his mind right. Jack felt anger rising in his chest, hot and bitter. He wasn't some foolish old man seeing things that weren't there. He knew what he'd witnessed, and he had physical evidence to prove it. But as he looked at Bradley's dismissive expression, he realized that pressing the issue would only make things worse. The sheriff had already decided Jack was either delusional or attention-seeking, and nothing Jack said would change his mind. Jack gathered his photographs, thanked Bradley coldly for his time, and left the office with his jaw clenched tight. Outside on the street, Jack ran into Martha Chun, who owned a local diner where he occasionally ate when he came to town. Martha had always been friendly to him, one of the few people in Red Mesa who seemed to genuinely respect his choice to live out in the wilderness alone. She took one look at Jack's face and asked what was wrong. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was the need to tell someone who might actually listen. But Jack found himself pouring out the whole story again, right there on the sidewalk in front of the sheriff's office. Martha listened without interruption, her expression serious and focused. When Jack finished, she didn't laugh or suggest he was seeing things. Instead, she told him something that made his blood run cold. Martha's cousin lived about 40 miles north, in the direction of the Air Force Base, and just last week, he'd called her with a strange story. He'd seen unusual lights in the sky, too, moving in ways that aircraft shouldn't move. And he wasn't the only one. There had been reports, quiet conversations among the locals, about strange phenomena in the skies over this part of Arizona. Nothing official, nothing that made it into the papers, but whispers nonetheless. Martha suggested that Jack talk to a man named David Kruger, a retired Air Force colonel who demoved to Red Mesa 5 years ago and now spent his days writing a book about his experiences in the military. Kruger lived on the eastern edge of town, in a small house he built with his own hands. Martha didn't know if Kruger would be interested in Jack's story, but she knew the man had always been curious about unexplained phenomena and might be more open-minded than Sheriff Bradley. Jack found Kruger's house easily enough, a neat property with a well-maintained yard that spoke to military discipline. Kruger himself answered the door, a tall, lean man in his early 70s with sharp blue eyes and the ramrod posture of someone who spent decades in uniform. When Jack introduced himself and explained why he'd come, Kruger invited him inside without hesitation, leading him to a study lined with books and military memorabilia. Kruger examined Jack's photographs with intense concentration, asking detailed questions about the timing of the sighting, the exact movements of the lights, the nature of the tracks. Unlike Sheriff Bradley, Kruger took notes, cross-referencing what Jack told him with information from various books and documents scattered across his desk. After an hour of conversation, Kruger sat back and fixed Jack with a serious stare that seemed to look right through him. What Kruger said next changed everything. He told Jack that he believed him completely and without reservation. More than that, Kruger revealed that during his years in the Air Force, he'd been part of a special unit tasked with investigating unexplained aerial phenomena. He'd seen things, documented things that the military would never acknowledge publicly. The patterns Jack described, the geometric precision of the tracks, the specific way the lights had moved, all of it matched reports Kruger had investigated decades ago. Reports that had been classified and buried under layers of bureaucracy and denial. Kruger explained that Jack S. Ranch might have been the site of what researchers called a landing event, where unidentified craft actually touched down rather than simply flying overhead. These events were rare, and they often left physical evidence that couldn't be easily explained away. The tracks Jack had found were particularly significant because they showed a level of organization and purpose that suggested intelligence, planning, and technology far beyond current human capabilities. Kruger told Jack that he needed to document everything more thoroughly, take more photographs, collect soil samples from the affected areas, and most importantly, watch his ranch carefully because there was a pattern to these events. Sites that experienced one landing often experienced more. Jack returned to his ranch that evening with new purpose and a growing sense of unease. Kruger had given him specific instructions on how to properly document the site, including taking measurements, creating detailed sketches, and collecting samples using techniques that wouldn't contaminate potential evidence. Kruger had also warned him about something else. Jack shouldn't be surprised if he started receiving visitors, people who would want to convince him that what he'd seen didn't happen, or that it could be easily explained through conventional means. That prediction came true faster than Jack had anticipated. 3 days after his visit to town, a black SUV arrived at his ranch just after dawn. 2 men in dark suits emerged, introducing themselves as agents from a government department whose name was so generic and forgettable that Jack couldn't remember it 5 minutes after they said it. They were polite but firm, asking to see where Jack had witnessed the unusual aerial phenomena. The term they used, aerial phenomena, told Jack that they knew exactly what he'd seen, regardless of what they might claim publicly. Jack led them to the southern pasture, where the tracks remained clearly visible despite 3 days of wind and his cattle grazing nearby. The men examined everything with professional thoroughness, taking their own photographs with expensive-looking equipment, collecting soil samples with scientific precision, and making notes in leather-bound notebooks. They asked Jack dozens of questions, but when he tried to ask them questions in return, their answers were vague and non-committal. They neither confirmed nor denied that similar events had occurred elsewhere. They neither confirmed nor denied that they knew what had caused the tracks. Before they left, the older of the 2 men, who'd introduced himself simply as Mr. Anderson, gave Jack a card with a phone number on it and nothing else. He told Jack to call immediately if he witnessed any other unusual activity, if the tracks changed in any way, or if he noticed anything else out of the ordinary. Then, almost as an afterthought, Mr. Anderson suggested that Jack might want to avoid discussing his experience with others. Not because the government wanted to suppress information, he was quick to add, but because public attention could complicate what was clearly a matter requiring careful investigation. The implication was clear: stay quiet, or there might be consequences. After the agents left, Jack felt more conflicted than ever. On one hand, Their visit validated his experience. The government clearly took this seriously enough to send investigators to his remote ranch. On the other hand, their vagueness and their thinly veiled suggestion that he remain silent made Jack wonder what they were really trying to accomplish. Was this a genuine investigation, or were they just trying to assess how much he knew and how much of a problem he might become? That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He found himself back on his porch, staring at the southern pasture, watching the stars and wondering if the lights would return. Around 2 in the morning, Rusty began to whinny nervously in the stable, and Jack's cattle started their low, anxious lowing. Jack's heart rate spiked. He grabbed his camera and a flashlight and headed toward the pasture, moving quickly but carefully through the darkness. As he approached the area where the tracks had been found, Jack saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A soft blue-green glow emanated from the ground itself, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The glow was centered around the largest circular impression, the 20-foot diameter circle that marked the center of the tracked area. Jack approached slowly, his flashlight beam seeming pale and weak compared to the strange luminescence rising from the earth. When he reached the edge of the glowing area, Jack knelt down and placed his hand near the ground. He could feel warmth radiating from the soil, a pleasant heat that had no obvious source. The glow pulsed more quickly as he moved his hand closer, almost as if it was responding to his presence. Jack pulled out his camera and began taking pictures, though he doubted the old Polaroid would capture the ethereal quality of what he was witnessing. For 30 minutes, Jack observed the phenomenon, documenting it as best he could. The glow gradually faded, slowly diminishing until it was barely visible, and then it was gone entirely, leaving only the starlit darkness of the desert night. Jack remained there for another hour, waiting to see if it would return, but the earth remained dark and quiet. When he finally walked back to the ranch house, he noticed that his watch had stopped, frozen at 2:17, even though he was certain more time had passed. Over the following days, Jack became increasingly paranoid. He noticed a car parked on the access road that led to his property, too far away to see clearly but obviously watching. His phone began to exhibit strange behaviors, clicks and echoes during conversations, as if someone might be listening in. When he drove into Red Mesa for supplies, he had the distinct impression he was being followed, though the vehicles always stayed far enough back that he couldn't be certain. Jack called Kruger to describe what was happening. The retired colonel listened carefully and then told Jack something chilling. This was standard procedure for these cases. When someone witnessed something significant and refused to quietly accept official explanations, they often found themselves under surveillance. Kruger advised Jack to continue documenting everything, but to be careful about where he stored his evidence and who he shared it with. The government agencies involved in investigating these phenomena had a long history of evidence disappearing, witnesses being discredited, and stories being buried under layers of misinformation. Jack began to feel trapped in his own life. The ranch that had always been his sanctuary now felt like a fishbowl, with unseen eyes watching his every move. He started keeping his photographs and notes in multiple locations, including a safety deposit box in a bank 2 towns over. He varied his routines, changed the times when he did his chores, took different routes when riding across his property. He wasn't sure if these precautions were necessary or if he was sliding into paranoia, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger and more complex was unfolding around him. Then, 12 days after the initial sighting, Jack received a visit from someone unexpected. A woman in her mid-30s arrived at his ranch in a dusty sedan, introducing herself as Dr. Sarah Chun, a physicist from a university in California. She explained that she was part of an unofficial network of scientists who investigated unexplained phenomena, working independently of government agencies. She'd heard about Jack's experience through channels she couldn't fully disclose, and she wanted to examine his evidence and conduct her own analysis of the site. Jack was suspicious at first after the government agents and the surveillance. He'd learned to be wary of strangers showing interest in his story. But Dr. Chun was patient and persuasive. She showed him credentials, provided references he could check, and most importantly, she shared information about other similar cases she'd investigated. Her knowledge was detailed and technical, far beyond what Jack would have expected from someone trying to deceive him. After several hours of conversation, Jack decided to trust her. Dr. Chun spent 3 days at the ranch, conducting what she called a comprehensive analysis of the site. She brought equipment Jack had never seen before, devices that measured electromagnetic fields, radiation levels, soil composition, and atmospheric conditions. She took dozens of samples, photographed everything from multiple angles, and created detailed maps of the track patterns. Throughout her investigation, she maintained a professional detachment, but Jack could see the excitement in her eyes. This wasn't just another case for her. This was potentially groundbreaking. On the second evening, as they sat on Jack's porch reviewing her findings, Dr. Chun shared her preliminary conclusions. The track showed evidence of weight distribution that didn't match any known vehicle or natural phenomenon. The soil compression indicated forces that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. Most intriguingly, her electromagnetic readings showed residual energy signatures at specific points along the track patterns, signatures that suggested the presence of propulsion systems operating on principles entirely different from combustion engines or conventional electric motors. But what really captured Dr. Chun's attention was something she'd discovered in the soil samples. Under microscopic analysis, she'd found unusual crystalline structures that shouldn't exist in natural desert soil. These microcrystals appeared to have been created by exposure to intense electromagnetic fields and temperatures far exceeding anything that should occur naturally in this environment. Similar microcrystals had been found at other alleged landing sites around the world, creating a pattern of physical evidence that was difficult to dismiss. Dr. Chun explained that what Jack had witnessed and documented could be among the most significant cases of the past decade. His photographs, combined with her scientific analysis, provided multiple forms of corroborating evidence that something extraordinary had occurred. She wanted to publish her findings, with Jack's permission, in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It would cause controversy, certainly, but it might also open doors to more serious scientific investigation of these phenomena. Jack was torn. Publication meant going public, exposing himself to ridicule and skepticism from the broader community. It also meant potentially more attention from the government agencies that were already watching him. But it also meant that his experience would be documented and preserved, that other witnesses might be encouraged to come forward, and that scientists might finally be able to study these events with the rigor they deserved. Before Jack could make his decision, everything changed. On the third night of Dr. Chen's stay, at approximately 3 in the morning, they both witnessed the lights returning. Jack heard Rusty's frantic whinnying and immediately knew what was happening. He and Dr. Chun rushed outside to see 5 lights, similar to those Jack had seen 2 weeks earlier, moving across the sky above the ranch. This time, Dr. Chun was there to witness it, to document it with her scientific equipment, to confirm that Jack hadn't imagined or misremembered what he'd seen. The lights performed the same impossible maneuvers, the sharp turns, the instantaneous stops and starts, the perfect geometric formations. Dr. Chun scrambled to set up her cameras and measurement devices, while Jack simply watched, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and terror. This was proof, undeniable proof, that something inexplicable was happening over his property. But it was also a reminder that he was dealing with forces and intelligences far beyond his understanding. The lights descended again, moving toward the same southern pasture where they'd left their marks before. Dr. Chun was recording everything, her hands steady despite what must have been tremendous excitement or fear. The lights hovered for several minutes, and then something new happened. something that hadn't occurred during Jack's first sighting. One of the lights broke away from the formation and moved directly toward the ranch house, toward where Jack and Dr. Chun stood watching. The light came closer and closer, growing larger and brighter, until it stopped perhaps 100 feet away from them, hovering at a height of about 30 feet. At this distance, Jack could see that it wasn't just a light. It was a craft of some kind, though its exact shape was difficult to discern because of the brilliant glow it emitted. The craft was silent, producing no sound at all despite clearly remaining stationary against the wind. Jack and Dr. Chun stood frozen, uncertain whether to run or continue observing. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the craft remained there, and Jack had the uncanny sensation of being observed, studied, analyzed by something or someone inside that glowing object. It was a profoundly unsettling feeling, stripping away his sense of being in control of his own environment and destiny. Then, just as suddenly as it approached, the craft rose swiftly to rejoin the other lights in the sky. The entire formation held its position for another minute before shooting away with incredible speed, disappearing into the vast darkness of space. Jack and Dr. Chun stood in stunned silence for several minutes after the lights vanished. When they finally spoke, their voices were shaky, adrenaline still coursing through their systems. Dr. Chun checked her equipment. Everything had recorded properly. They had video footage, electromagnetic readings, thermal imaging, multiple forms of data capturing what they just witnessed. This was no longer just Jack's story. It was documented scientific observation. The next morning, they returned to the southern pasture to find new tracks. These were different from the first set, more complex, creating patterns that seemed almost like written language or mathematical equations. The circles were smaller, but more numerous, arranged in intricate spirals and interconnected designs that covered nearly 4 acres. The vegetation in this larger area showed the same bleaching effect, but more pronounced, with some plants completely desiccated. Dr. Chun worked frantically to document everything before the evidence could degrade or be interfered with. She knew, as Jack did, that this site had become something significant, a place where contact or near contact had occurred not once but twice. The implications were staggering. Whatever intelligence was behind these craft, they had chosen Jack's ranch for a reason, and they had returned deliberately to the same location. As Dr. Chun packed up her equipment to head back to California and begin analyzing her data, she warned Jack that his life was about to change dramatically. Once she published her findings, once the scientific community and the public learned about what had happened here, Jack's privacy would be gone forever. His ranch would become famous or infamous, depending on who was telling the story. People would come believers, skeptics, scientists, tourists, conspiracy theorists. The government agencies would likely intensify their interest. Jack needed to prepare himself for the storm that was coming. The storm arrived faster than either of them had anticipated. Within a week of Dr. Chun's departure, Jack's phone began ringing constantly. Somehow, despite their attempts at discretion, word had leaked about what had been witnessed and documented at the ranch. Reporters called, asking for interviews. UFO researchers reached out, wanting to visit the site. Television producers offered money for exclusive access. Through it all, Jack maintained as much silence as he could, referring everyone to Dr. Chen's upcoming publication and refusing to give interviews or allow visitors onto his property. The government agents returned, this time with less courtesy and more insistence. They wanted all of Jack's photographs, all of his documentation, all of Dr. Chun's data. They implied that national security might be at stake, that Jack could be in violation of various regulations by publicizing information about aerial phenomena that might relate to classified military operations. Jack refused to hand over anything, though he knew this defiance might bring consequences. The town of Red Mesa became divided over Jack's story. Some residents believed him, particularly after Martha Chun and several others came forward with their own sightings of unusual lights in the area. Others thought Jack was either lying for attention or had genuinely lost his grip on reality. Sheriff Bradley gave an interview to a regional newspaper dismissing the entire affair as a hoax or delusion, which only intensified the controversy. Jack found himself alternately defended and ridiculed, celebrated and scorned, depending on who was speaking. Through all of this, Jack kept watching the skies and monitoring his property. The lights didn't return, but the tracks remained, slowly degrading under the effects of wind and weather, but still visible to anyone who knew where to look. Jack began to feel like a guardian of sorts, protecting this evidence of something profound and mysterious that had occurred on his land. Dr. Chen's paper was published in a respected scientific journal 3 months after her visit. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some scientists praised her rigorous methodology and called for further investigation of the phenomena she documented. Others attacked her credentials and methodology, suggesting she'd been deceived by a hoax or had allowed her objectivity to be compromised by a desire for sensational findings. The debate raged in academic journals, scientific conferences, and online forums, with Jack's ranch becoming shorthand for the ongoing controversy over unexplained aerial phenomena. What surprised Jack most was that he began hearing from other witnesses, people from across the country and even around the world who'd experienced similar events. Some had seen lights that moved in impossible ways. Others had found strange tracks or marks on their property. Many had stayed silent for years, afraid of ridicule or disbelief, but Jack's willingness to come forward had given them courage to share their own stories. A picture began to emerge of a phenomenon that was far more widespread than anyone had publicly acknowledged. A pattern of events that suggested something significant was happening in our skies and on our land. Colonel Kruger became a regular visitor to the ranch, helping Jack document new developments and serving as an advisor on how to deal with the various agencies and organizations interested in the case. Kruger revealed more about his own experiences in the Air Force, stories about investigations he'd been part of, evidence he'd seen that had been classified and buried. He told Jack that he believed they were on the verge of a major shift in public understanding, that cases like Jack's were accumulating to the point where official denial would no longer be sustainable. A year after the initial sighting, Jack's life had found a new equilibrium. The media attention had faded somewhat, though he still received occasional requests for interviews or visits. The government agencies had backed off, perhaps realizing that heavy-handed tactics would only draw more attention to the case. The tracks had degraded significantly, but were still visible, documented in Dr. Chen's photographs and measurements for posterity. Jack had installed better cameras and monitoring equipment around his property, ready to capture evidence if the lights ever returned. But beyond the practical changes, something deeper had shifted in Jack Thornton. The experience had cracked open his previously rigid worldview, forcing him to accept that reality was stranger and more complex than he'd ever imagined. He thought differently about his place in the universe, about humanity's significance or lack thereof in the cosmic scheme. He looked at the stars with new eyes, seeing them not just as distant points of light, but as potential homes to intelligences that might occasionally visit Earth for reasons we couldn't yet understand. Jack never regretted coming forward with his story, despite the controversy and disruption it had brought to his life. He felt he'd done what was right, what was necessary. He de-documented something important and shared it with people who could analyze it scientifically and preserve the evidence for future understanding. 5 years after that fateful November night, Jack Thornton still worked his land under the vast Arizona sky, but he was no longer alone in his vigil. His ranch had become an unofficial research station, visited regularly by scientists, astronomers, and serious researchers who treated the site with the respect it deserved. Dr. Sarah Chun had become a close friend, returning several times a year to conduct follow-up studies and monitor for any new activity. The tracks had long since faded from the desert floor, erased by wind and rain and the passage of time, but their measurements and photographs remained preserved in multiple scientific databases. Dr. Chun's paper had spawned dozens of follow-up studies, and while consensus remained elusive, the scientific community could no longer simply dismiss such cases out of hand. Jack's willingness to come forward had created a small but significant crack in the wall of silence surrounding unexplained aerial phenomena. The lights never returned to Jack's ranch, at least not in the obvious, dramatic way they had that November. But Jack had learned to notice subtler things, unusual electromagnetic readings on certain nights, his cattle becoming inexplicably nervous at specific times, brief flashes of light on the horizon that appeared and vanished too quickly to photograph. He'd come to believe that whatever intelligence had visited his ranch that night was still watching, still present in ways that were harder to detect and document. Martha Chun had opened a small museum in Red Mesa, dedicating one room to the events at Jack's ranch. It displayed copies of his photographs, excerpts from Dr. Chen's research, and testimonies from other witnesses who'd experienced similar phenomena in the region. The museum had become a modest tourist attraction, bringing needed revenue to the struggling town and legitimizing, to some degree, the experiences of those who'd seen things they couldn't explain. Jack had received letters from hundreds of people sharing their own encounters, thanking him for his courage in speaking publicly about something so easily ridiculed. Many of these letter writers described feeling isolated and alone with their experiences until they heard Jack's story. In that sense, whatever else had resulted from that November night, Jack had helped create a community of witnesses who no longer had to suffer their knowledge in silence. On clear nights, Jack still stood on his porch with his coffee, watching the stars and wondering. He thought about the craft that had hovered before him and Dr. Chen, about the sensation of being observed by an intelligence entirely unlike his own. He wondered what they had been looking for, what they had found, and whether they would ever make their presence and purposes fully known to humanity. He suspected those answers, if they ever came, would arrive long after his time on Earth had ended. But Jack Thornton had done his part. He'd witnessed, documented, and testified. He'd stood firm against skepticism and pressure to remain silent. He'd contributed to humanity's understanding, however incomplete, of a mystery that stretched far beyond one cowboy's ranch in the Arizona desert. And every night as he looked up at the infinite stars scattered across the darkness, Jack Thornton knew with absolute certainty that we are not alone in this vast universe, and that knowledge, humbling and terrifying and wondrous as it was, had changed him forever. The desert kept its secrets, but it had shared one of them with Jack Thornton, and he had made sure that secret would not die in silence.